Welcome to the supernatural tale of a stranger's grace. Written by Harmony Taylor, presented by Dawnspire Digital. Each week we uncover mysteries where we'll meet God. May you enjoy this week's episode.
Chapter 6. Eleanor hummed softly as she arranged the freshly baked cookies on the wire rack, the scent of vanilla and cinnamon filling her small apartment. The warm aroma wrapped around her like a comforting blanket, pushing back the lingering shadows in her mind. Baking had always been her refuge, a way to ground herself when the world felt too heavy. Today, it felt like a small rebellion against the isolation that had become her constant companion. She glanced at the clock. Almost 6. The evening had crept up on her. Instead of retreating to the couch with the television as her only company, she had pulled out her grandmother's old recipe book. The worn pages held memories of standing beside her grandmother Nellie, rolling dough with clumsy hands while Nellie guided her gently. The kitchen had always been a place of warmth, laughter, and love. A knock at the door startled her, the sound sharp in the quiet. Eleanor wiped her hands on a dish towel, heart quickening. It was unusual for anyone to visit at this hour. A flicker of unease stirred, but she brushed it aside. She had nothing to fear. Not anymore. Opening the door, her smile faltered. Mrs. Goldblum? Her neighbor, usually so composed, looked disheveled. Her silver hair was mussed, her blouse wrinkled, and her eyes, wide and unfocused, darted around the hallway. "Dear Eleanor," Mrs. Goldblum said, her voice trembling, I seem to have misplaced my keys. I can't find them anywhere, and I'm afraid I may have left the stove on." Eleanor's heart sank. Mrs. Goldblum had been growing more forgetful lately, but this was different. She looked lost, frightened in a way Eleanor had never seen before. "Come in," Eleanor said gently, guiding her neighbor inside. As they walked, Eleanor noticed a dark bruise on Mrs. Goldblum's wrist, the size of a plum. She frowned but said nothing, not wanting to alarm her. Mrs. Goldblum sank into the armchair with a sigh. "I could have sworn I left my keys in my purse," she muttered, "but they're gone." "And the stove?" Eleanor asked, her concern deepening. Mrs. Goldblum nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. "I can't remember if I turned it off. You know how forgetful I've been." "We'll figure it out," Eleanor reassured her. "Let's go to the front desk. They'll have a spare key." Mrs. Goldblum's face brightened slightly. "You're right. I don't know what I'd do without you." Eleanor grabbed her cardigan and helped Mrs. Goldblum to her feet. They made their way to the elevator in silence, the soft hum of the machinery filling the space between them. Eleanor cast a glance at her neighbor, noticing how frail she seemed, her once vibrant spirit dimmed by confusion. At the front desk, Marcus, the night concierge, barely looked up from his paperwork. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the keyboard, and his expression shifted from disinterest to mild recognition when he saw Mrs. Goldblum. "She's misplaced her keys," Eleanor explained, keeping her voice light despite the growing knot of unease. "And she's worried about the stove." Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Again?" Eleanor's cheeks flushed slightly at his tone. "Yes, again," she replied, her voice firmer now. "Can you help us?" With a resigned grunt, Marcus stood and reached for the master key, moving with deliberate slowness. "All right, let's go." As they made their way back to the elevator, Marcus muttered, "This is the 3rd time this week. Someone should talk to her about getting some help." Eleanor's jaw tightened. She glanced at Mrs. Goldblum, who seemed blissfully unaware of Marcus's rudeness. Now wasn't the time to argue. "Let's just check the apartment," she said, her voice clipped. When they arrived, Marcus unlocked the door and went straight to the kitchen. Eleanor stayed close to Mrs. Goldblum, her hand resting lightly on the older woman's arm. A few moments later, Marcus called out, "The stove was still on, but I've turned it off. No harm done." Mrs. Goldblum let out a shaky breath. "Thank goodness." "And your keys," Marcus added, holding them up. Chen counter. Mrs. Goldblum blinked, her brow furrowing. "But I could have sworn." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Marcus, both of them sharing the same unspoken thought. Mrs. Goldblum's memory was slipping more than either of them wanted to admit. "Everything's fine now," Eleanor said gently. "Let's get you settled." After Marcus left, Eleanor poured 2 cups of tea and brought the plate of cookies to the table. As they sat together, the tension in the room began to ease. Mrs. Goldblum took a sip of her tea, her hands still trembling. "You're such a dear, Eleanor. I don't know what I'd do without you." Eleanor smiled softly, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the image of the bruise on Mrs. Goldblum's wrist, or the way her memory had faltered. Something was wrong, and Eleanor knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. "Mrs. Goldblum," she began hesitantly, "have you spoken to your doctor recently? About your memory?" Mrs. Goldblum looked down at her cup. "I've been meaning to," she whispered, "but it's hard to face, you know. Getting older. It's not easy." Eleanor reached across the table, placing her hand over Mrs. Goldblum's. "I understand, but maybe it's time to talk to someone, just to make sure everything's all right." Mrs. Goldblum nodded slowly. "You're right, I'll make an appointment. I'll go with you if you'd like." Mrs. Goldblum smiled, a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Eleanor. That means more to me than you know." They sat in silence for a while, the warmth of the tea offering a moment of comfort, but Eleanor's mind was racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger. As they finished their tea, Eleanor helped Mrs. Goldblum to her feet. "You should get some rest," she said gently. "I'll check on you in the morning." Mrs. Goldblum nodded, her movements slow and tired. "Good night, Eleanor, and thank you for everything." Eleanor watched her neighbor shuffle to the bedroom, her heart heavy with concern. She lingered for a moment longer, her gaze drifting to the darkening sky outside. The weight of the evening pressed down on her, but beneath the worry, there was a flicker of something else, a quiet determination to be there for Mrs. Goldblum, no matter what. As she closed the door behind her and made her way back to her own apartment, Eleanor couldn't help but glance out the corridor's window. And there, in the fading light, she saw him. Jez. He sat on the same bench, his hands clasped in his lap, his head bowed as if in prayer. There was something about his presence that calmed her, a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him, even from a distance. Eleanor stood at the window for a long time, watching him, her heart full of questions she didn't yet know how to ask. But one thing was certain, Jez was no ordinary man, and somehow, in ways she couldn't yet understand, he was connected to everything that was happening. With a deep breath, Eleanor turned away from the window, her mind racing with thoughts of Mrs. Goldblum, of Jez, of the journey she had only just begun. There was so much she didn't know, so much she still had to face. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel so alone. And that, she realized, was what really mattered. Jesus had found her, and she had accepted him.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. You can read the entire book available on Amazon. Get more content by visiting dawnspiredigital.com. I'll see you next time. May God's peace be with you.